December 31st, 1775, 250 years ago today. Benedict Arnold leads a blizzard assault on Quebec. His commander dies in the first minutes. 400 men are captured. The invasion of Canada collapses. Arnold's career should have ended that night. Instead, it flourished. This is the prosecution of Benedict Arnold for murder. Not one count, hundreds. The men who died in Maine, the men who died at Quebec, and eventually, the men he would have sold at West Point. Quebec didn't make Arnold a traitor, it trained him for treason. Exhibit 1, Narcissism as a Force Multiplier. Arnold proposed attacking Quebec City by traveling through Maine in 20 days to appear in force on the St. Lawrence. The point was speed and surprise. If it worked, it would be a headline victory that would secure his position as a creative tactician who can achieve the impossible. With more chances of failure than success, a prudent commander would have reconsidered. Arnold discovered a map that showed the distance was only 180 miles. Instead of sending scouts out or verifying the map, which stood in contradiction to other contemporary maps, he failed to consider the oppositional evidence and pitched it to General Washington and the Continental Congress. Arnold's letter to Washington admits the struggle to meet his schedule. Washington might think them tardy, but given the conditions, he would have taken the men for amphibious animals. So often were they underwater. It is the language of a man narrating himself, even while he is still in the mud. The reality under the narration was brutal. The expedition bled men and supplies. Boats were lost, food ran short, distance estimates proved optimistic. No commander gets credit for starving his own column. Needs must when the devil drives. And Arnold drove. Arnold believed ordinary limits didn't bind him. That belief dragged a starving force through impossible terrain. In military terms, you could call it an audacity advantage, a force multiplier that is real until it is not. Exhibit 2, Narcissism as a Fatal Flaw. A commander can be wrong about distance. A commander can be unlucky with weather. A commander can take losses. The real question is what he does when the plan falls apart and the bill comes due. Arnold's pattern at Quebec is not merely that he failed. It is that he could not metabolize failure in a normal way. He could not accept that the plan's premises were flawed or that he owned those flaws. So he did what men like that do. He found bodies to lay the blame on. During the march, the breaking moment came with Lieutenant Colonel Roger Enos turning back with a large portion of the rear division. Arnold's correspondence shows him framing the reduction in numbers as a controlled decision rather than a collapse in cohesion. In his Nov 8, 1775 letter to Washington, Arnold described ordering Enos to send back those who were not fit and explained the shrinking column as a response to shortages and boat losses. I ordered sounds different than my rear division deserted. Arnold needed the failure to be external. The story stayed intact. Arnold drives forward. Others lack nerve. Then comes the assault itself. The Battle of Quebec happened on December 31st, 1775. The basic facts are stable across the major summaries. Montgomery was killed early in the attack. Arnold was wounded. Daniel Morgan and more than 400 Americans were taken prisoner. The city held. When Montgomery fell, the southern column faltered and withdrew. Arnold's northern column, now without its pincer partner, fought into the lower town and got trapped. That is how Morgan ends up captured and why the casualty list is not just killed, but captured. Afterward, Arnold's blame allocation hardened fast. Contemporary documents from the Canadian campaign show Arnold writing from the hospital and reporting the defeat while also shaping who should wear it. The Northern Illinois University collection preserves Arnold's correspondence to Wooster from the General Hospital, dated January 2nd, 1776. Even without quoting every line, the known thrust is consistent with the pattern. Montgomery becomes martyr. Arnold becomes wounded hero. The retreating subordinate becomes the problem. This is his fatal flaw, the inability to accept responsibility without translating it into personal humiliation, and then converting that humiliation into rage and scapegoating. At Quebec, that mechanism becomes visible in daylight. Exhibit 3, the War Council. The Council of War on December 26, 1775, forced a choice under a deadline. The enlistments of much of the army expired on December 31st. On January 1st, the force investing Quebec would, on paper and in practice, begin to dissolve. That ticking clock compressed every argument into one question: attack now or admit the campaign had run out of road. For Richard Montgomery, the problem was arithmetic as much as courage. The siege lines were thin, the weather was degrading, and time was not an ally. The longer the Americans lingered, the more likely it became that British reinforcements would arrive, and the entire Canadian venture would collapse. From the subtext of communications, it appears that Montgomery believed his honor may have been at stake, just as it had been for other military men who crossed Benedict Arnold. For Arnold, the stakes were more personal and more dangerous. He had dragged a column through the Maine wilderness on the strength of promises, promises of speed, surprise, and a swift seizure of Quebec. By the time he reached the St. Lawrence, the expedition was already an argument waiting to happen. Men lost to starvation and exposure, boats ruined, supplies wasted, discipline frayed. Worse, the retreat of Roger Enos at the Great Carrying Place had cut the muscle out of the march and carried off precious provisions. Arnold could have interpreted that as grim logistics. Instead, he treated it like betrayal, an insult with operational consequences. It narrowed what he could psychologically tolerate. A prudent commander might have looked at the condition of the troops, the lack of heavy artillery, and the strength of the city's defenses, and concluded that the only rational move was to withdraw, regroup, and live to try again. Arnold could not afford that conclusion. Retreat without an assault would have forced him to say out loud that the march had been a ruinous gamble. It would have turned a hard luck epic into an indictment of his judgment. It would have ruined him. The honor trap took form. Quebec became less a target than a test. And the test was not merely whether the city could be taken, but whether Arnold's original miracle could be justified. If he attacked and lost, he could argue that the failure belonged to weather, enlistments, betrayal, or the inherent strength of the fortress. If he attacked and won, he would be untouchable. Either way, the act of attacking converted a logistical catastrophe into a martial narrative. It gave him an explanation that sounded like valor instead of miscalculation. The council itself is hard to pin down in the way modern readers want. There were no formal minutes or memorandum. What we have is reconstruction, journals, later recollections, and the shape of orders that followed. But the contours are clear enough. Montgomery and Arnold were the essential poles. Daniel Morgan's role mattered because his riflemen were both the most aggressive element and, at the same time, a source of friction. Men who saw themselves as a cut above the ordinary line and did not always submit easily to plans that smelled like suicide. Around them were field officers whose diaries preserved the mood: hunger, cold, impatience, and the creeping suspicion that they were being asked to storm an impregnable place with too little and too late. There was dissent, and it was not trivial. Some officers were averse to the idea of a sudden assault. That aversion was not cowardice, so much as recognition. Quebec was not a frontier stockade. It was a fortified city with a prepared defense and enough men behind the walls to punish a half-fed attacking force that had no real siege train. A deserter had already compromised at least one earlier concept of attack, and the British were alert. In that context, caution had a legitimate argument: delay, preserve what remained, and avoid sacrificing the core of the expedition in a single night. An army in being is worth more than an army lost. But caution ran straight into the calendar. Delay meant disintegration. Delay meant watching enlistments expire while the army froze outside the walls. Delay meant conceding that the entire campaign had reached a dead end. Montgomery understood that. Arnold could not accept anything else. Morgan's support silenced the doubters. The question became how, not whether. The plan: night assault during a blizzard. Two columns converge in Lower Town, then storm upward. Complex, dependent on timing, weather, coordination, everything they lacked. It was audacious, and it matched the temperament of both principal commanders in different ways. For Montgomery, it was a last throw made necessary by time. For Arnold, it was something more like psychological necessity, an attempt to force reality to ratify his earlier certainty. That decision did exactly what Arnold needed in the short term. It created a clear event that could redeem the march, or at least explain it, and it set the table for the catastrophe on December 31st. Montgomery killed early, his column broken, Arnold wounded in the northern attack, Morgan's men driven forward into a trap once the southern pressure evaporated, hundreds taken prisoner, the invasion's momentum effectively snapped. The most revealing part comes after the guns die down. Arnold, now injured and no longer on the line, immediately begins shaping the story of why it failed and who should carry the weight of it. He does not treat the assault as an overreach compelled by deteriorating circumstances. He treats it as a near success, spoiled by others, by retreat, by insufficient zeal, by failure to press forward at the critical moment. His wound becomes a credential. It is not merely proof that he was present, it becomes proof that he is exempt from blame. December 26 wasn't just a pivot toward a storming attempt. It was the moment Arnold locked himself into a logic that would follow him for years. If he can force the crisis, he can control the narrative. If he can control the narrative, he can survive the outcome. And if he can survive the outcome, especially when others pay the price, then he learns the most dangerous lesson of all, that failure, properly staged, can still be a form of victory. Exhibit 4: The survival of Quebec should have ended Arnold. He lost the assault. Hundreds were captured. The invasion of Canada effectively collapsed after the failure to take Quebec and the later arrival of British reinforcements. In a normal military system, that kind of operational failure carries consequences. At minimum, it curbs a man's climb. Instead, Arnold's career not only survived, it gained altitude. Washington's reaction matters because it shows what the institution rewarded. On Jan 27, 1776, Washington wrote to Arnold with a line that has echoed ever since. It is not in the power of any man to command success, but Arnold had deserved it, and Washington wished him recovery and the possession of those laurels, which your bravery and perseverance justly merit. That is a commander in chief endorsing the hero story, even in defeat, not irrationally either. Washington needed aggressive officers. He also needed symbols. Montreal had fallen. Montgomery was dead. The revolution was young and fragile. A wounded officer who could be cast as almost succeeded had value. Congress reinforced the lesson, promoting Arnold to brigadier general on January 10, 1776. It was transactional. The march and the wound purchased status. Arnold learned that he could bring an operation to disaster, and if he framed it correctly, if he bled in the right place, if the right people needed a hero, he would still be celebrated. It wasn't career survival, it was moral hazard. Exhibit 5: The Contract. I give you miracles, you give me adulation. A man who performs miracles begins to believe he is owed payment in a specific currency. Not money first, recognition, deference, the public confirmation that he is the man he imagines himself to be. Quebec minted that contract. The terms are simple. I deliver the impossible. You deliver adulation and advancement. For a time, the system played along. Washington praised him. Congress promoted him. The legend formed early. The march through hell, the wound at the barricade, the refusal to quit. Then the system started behaving like a real institution. Institutions investigate. They promote other people. They question accounts. They distribute credit. They do not live to reflect one man's ego back at him. The dynamic occurs long before West Point. You do not need to jump ahead to West Point to see this dynamic. Even mainstream biographical summaries note Arnold's growing conviction that Congress failed to reward him properly and that perceived slights piled up. When Congress and peers treated him as accountable, when they acted like he was one officer among many, Arnold read it as breach, not mere disappointment. Breach. At that point, the logic becomes cold. If one patron will not pay in admiration and status, find another. Empires can be patrons too. The British crown had titles, money, and the kind of formal rank Arnold craved. Quebec did not create the temptation. Quebec proved the model. Survive failure, sell the story, demand the reward. The verdict. Quebec taught Arnold the most dangerous lesson a narcissist can learn. You can fail catastrophically and still be called a hero, as long as you control the story. Washington praised him. Congress promoted him. The legend formed. But before we talk about what Arnold became, let's count what Arnold cost. The march through Maine, 500 men, dead or deserted because Arnold used a bad map, refused scouts, and wouldn't turn back when the plan collapsed. The assault on Quebec, 400 plus men, captured or killed because Arnold needed an attack to justify the march. Montgomery died leading that attack. Morgan spent months in a British prison, 700 men, not for tactical advantage, for Arnold's reputation. That is the crime, not that he failed. Commanders fail, not that men died. War kills. The crime is that Arnold sacrificed his men to protect his ego. When Enos turned back, Arnold needed scapegoats. When the march became disaster, Arnold needed redemption. When Montgomery hesitated, Arnold needed the assault. Every decision prioritized Arnold's narrative over his men's lives. The march didn't have to happen. Other routes existed. The assault didn't have to happen. Retreat was the rational choice. But Arnold's reputation required both, and 700 men paid the price. The prosecution rests on this. Benedict Arnold committed murder by command decision. He knowingly chose his reputation over his soldiers' lives. He did it in Maine. He did it at Quebec. And when Congress finally tried to hold him accountable, when they audited instead of adulated, he found a patron who wouldn't question him, the British Empire. The treason at West Point wasn't a separate crime. It was the same crime, scaled up. At Quebec, Arnold sacrificed 700 men for his reputation. At West Point, he tried to sacrifice an entire army. The pattern never changed, only the price. Guilty, on all counts, 250 years overdue.